"I can't live without a man," said the Apache girl. The rancher let her stay. The dry wind rolled across the plains, carrying with it the dust of endless miles and the whisper of secrets too old for men to remember. The sun was fierce that day, settling low in the western sky, spreading its golden blaze across the rugged land where cattle grazed lazily and shadows stretched long. John McAllister, a rancher who had lived most of his life on that isolated stretch of land, leaned against the weathered post outside his barn, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He had grown used to silence, to the company of cattle, the creak of windmills, and the occasional distant howl of coyotes. But that evening, silence broke. From the far line of mesquite trees, a figure appeared, frail, barefoot, and walking as though each step carried the weight of 1,000 miles. She was a girl, her hair tangled black, her skin the warm tone of the desert earth, her dress torn and clinging to her. Her eyes burned with both fear and fire. She stumbled forward until she reached the barn. John pushed himself upright, his hand instinctively brushing against the revolver at his side, though he didn't draw it. "Who are you?" His voice was steady, carrying that rancher's edge of caution. The girl lifted her chin, though exhaustion tugged at her every limb. "I am Apache," she said, her voice cracked but strong. "My name is Ahioka. I can't live without a man. If you send me away, I will die." John narrowed his eyes, studying her face, reading the desperation etched in her words. The plains weren't kind. A girl alone, Apache or not, wouldn't last long against wolves, hunger, or worse. Still, he wasn't a man who made decisions with his heart. Life had taught him not to. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Because you are alone," she replied, as if the answer was carved into her bones. "And because I have no one." Her words struck him harder than the scorching wind. John had buried loneliness so deep under work and silence, he had almost forgotten its shape. Yet, here it stood before him in the form of a weary Apache girl with fire in her eyes and no place to call home. He motioned toward the barn door. "Come inside before the coyotes catch the scent of you." That night, Ahioka sat at his wooden table, eating bread and beans as if it were a feast. John watched her quietly, her every move cautious but filled with dignity. She wasn't like the settlers' women he had known, nor was she like the Apache warriors he had once seen riding wild across the hills. She was something else, caught between worlds, carrying a strength born of survival. Days turned into weeks. Ahioka rose with the sun, working beside John, tending the cattle, hauling water, mending fences with hands blistered but uncomplaining. She never asked for pity. She never begged for more than she was given. Yet, when night came and the fire burned low, she would sometimes whisper stories of her people, the songs sung beneath the stars, the way her mother had braided her hair, the sound of drums that now existed only in her memory. John listened. He never admitted it, but her voice filled the silence in ways the wind never could. One evening, after a long day of branding cattle, John found her sitting by the corral fence, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The setting sun painted her face with gold, but her expression carried the weight of sorrow. "You still think about leaving," he said, more as a statement than a question. She turned to him slowly. "I think about a world where I belong. But I know it no longer exists." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "Without a man, without someone to hold onto in this world, I am already half gone. That is why I came to you." John felt the truth in her words. He, too, had been living like a ghost, tethered to the land but drifting through time with no anchor. His wife had died years ago, leaving him with nothing but a ranch too large for one man and a silence too deep for one heart. Ahioka wasn't just asking for survival, she was offering something he hadn't dared to want again: companionship, a chance to be needed, to be more than a shadow of himself. The days grew softer after that. Not easy. Ranch life was never easy, but filled with a kind of rhythm that carried meaning. She brought laughter to the porch, humming half-remembered songs while she sewed torn shirts. He taught her to ride the horses with a steady hand, to lasso calves, to fire a rifle when danger came too close. Side by side, they became something the land itself seemed to recognize, two souls no longer lost, but bound by necessity and a quiet understanding. But the world beyond the ranch was not blind. Whispers carried. A rancher living with an Apache girl stirred unease among neighbors who already feared the tribes. Men muttered in town, their eyes sharp with prejudice. Warnings reached John's ears. That girl will bring trouble. One night, a group of riders came to his gate, torches flickering against the darkness. Their voices were filled with suspicion and scorn. She don't belong here, McAllister. Send her back to her people, or wherever she came from. John stood tall, his hand resting on the rifle at his side, though he didn't raise it. He felt Ahioka behind him, silent but steady. His voice carried through the night like iron striking stone. She stays. The riders shifted uneasily, but something in his tone made them hesitate. They muttered curses, spat on the ground, and rode away, their torches fading into the night. When the dust settled, John turned to find Ahioka watching him, her dark eyes glistening with something unspoken. Gratitude, yes, but also a fierce bond, the kind that came only when two people had stood against the world together. The rancher who had once lived in silence now had a voice beside his own, a reason to rise each morning, a fire that warmed more than just the hearth. And the Apache girl who believed she could not live without a man found not just a protector, but a partner who saw her worth beyond desperation. The land still stretched vast and unforgiving around them, the wind still carried its lonely song, but within that small ranch house, there was something the wilderness could never break, a fragile, powerful belonging, born from need but grown into something deeper, something neither of them had expected to find. The prairie wind never rested, carrying with it the smell of sagebrush, dust, and the faint echo of coyotes calling to each other in the far-off ridges. John McAllister knew every sound of that land, every shift in the breeze, every note of silence that came before a storm. Yet now the rhythms of his world had changed, because inside the walls of his weathered ranch house sat a girl who did not belong, yet somehow belonged more than anyone else. Ahioka had brought with her a fire that John had thought long buried. She rose before dawn, silent as a shadow, her bare feet soft on the wooden floors. She carried water from the well, fed the horses, mended fences with hands blistered and raw. She did not shrink from work, nor from the loneliness of the plains. But her presence was more than labor. She brought a pulse, a heartbeat that John had not felt in years. He would glance at her when she was not watching, the way her hair caught the light when she leaned over the corral, the quiet strength in her back when she hauled feed, the flicker of sadness when she thought no one was near. Nights were different now, the silence was no longer hollow. She would sit by the fire, telling him of her people's songs, of the dances under the moon, of the stories whispered by elders about the spirits of the earth. Her voice carried sorrow and pride in equal measure. John listened, the fire crackling between them, and though he did not speak of his own past, he found himself remembering the laughter of his wife, the child they had lost before birth, the emptiness that had followed. One evening, as the stars scattered across the velvet sky, Ahioka sat with a length of twine in her hands, weaving it into a pattern. John leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "What are you making?" he asked. "A net," she said softly, her eyes focused on the threads. "It catches dreams. My mother taught me." She lifted it, the firelight shining through its delicate web. "Bad dreams are trapped. Good dreams pass through." John stared at it, the raw memory of his wife's nightmares stirring in him. He said nothing, but when she hung the net above her bed in the small room she had claimed, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over the house. Days blended into weeks, and though the ranch still demanded everything of them, life felt fuller, more bearable. Yet John knew danger lurked beyond the fences. Men whispered in town, casting suspicious glances when he rode in for supplies. They called him a fool, claimed the girl would betray him, steal from him, or worse. But John had seen her eyes. He had seen her exhaustion, her loneliness, her desperate need to anchor herself to something steady. He had chosen to believe her. One afternoon, a storm rolled across the plains, dark clouds boiling like angry smoke. The cattle grew restless, their cries sharp in the rising wind. John and Ahioka worked side by side, driving them toward safer ground. Lightning split the sky, thunder cracked like the voice of God himself. Rain lashed against their faces, soaking their clothes, turning the earth to mud. In the chaos, a calf was swept toward a swollen creek. Without hesitation, Ahioka leapt from her horse, plunging into the torrent. John shouted her name, his voice swallowed by the storm, but she fought her way toward the frightened animal, her arms wrapping around its slick body. With strength born of desperation, she pushed it to the bank, coughing and gasping as John pulled them both to safety. When they stumbled back into the barn, dripping and shivering, John grabbed her shoulders, his voice rough with fear and anger. "You could have drowned." Her dark eyes blazed. Better to drown saving life than to live with empty hands. The force of her words struck him like a hammer. He saw in her not just a girl desperate for survival, but a spirit forged in fire, a soul unwilling to wither. Something in him broke open then, something he had kept sealed for too long. He wanted to protect her. Yes, but more than that, he wanted to stand beside her, not above her. The storm passed, but the memory of it lingered. That night, as the wind howled outside, John found himself sitting closer to her by the fire, their silence heavy with unspoken truths. He reached for her hand, rough and scarred like his own. She let him hold it, her fingers trembling only slightly before they grew still. But the peace they carved for themselves was fragile. Trouble did not forget. Days later, riders appeared again at the edge of his land, their voices sharp with threat. They accused him of harboring an enemy, of betraying his kind. John stood firm, his rifle in hand, his jaw set like stone. "She stays," he repeated, the same iron in his voice as before. They left with promises of return, promises dripping with menace. John knew they would not let the matter rest. He also knew that his choice had bound him to her in a way that could not be undone. That night, Ahioka sat by the window, staring into the endless dark. "They will not stop," she whispered. "Men fear what they do not understand. They will try to take me over my dead body," John muttered, the weight of his words pressing down on him. She turned to him then, her face shadowed but her eyes glowing with fierce light. "I told you I cannot live without a man. But it is not just survival I speak of. It is this." She touched her chest, just above her heart, "to have someone who sees me, not as enemy, not as burden, but as life." John felt his throat tighten. He had thought himself too old, too worn, too broken to feel the stir of such words. But there they were, cutting into him like truth always does. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms. She trembled against him, not with fear but with release, as though the weight she carried finally had a place to rest. From that night on, their bond deepened. They worked as one, laughed as one, dreamed as one. John taught her how to read from the few books his wife had left behind, her finger tracing the words as she mouthed them slowly, her face lighting up when she understood. She, in turn, taught him songs of the Apache, the rhythm of drums recreated by her hands against the table, the melody of a tongue foreign to his but rich with meaning. Still, shadows hung over them. John rode to town less often, wary of the stares and whispers. Supplies grew scarce. He knew a reckoning was coming, a clash between the world outside and the fragile world they had built together. It came one night in the form of fire. Flames licked the horizon, torches carried by men who rode hard and fast. John and Ahioka stood at the porch as the riders approached, their voices carrying hatred across the night air. "Give her up, McAllister. Send her out, and we'll leave you be." John's rifle gleamed in the torchlight. His voice was calm, but beneath it burned steel. "She stays." A gunshot cracked, the sound tearing through the silence. Bullets whistled, wood splintered, glass shattered. John pulled Ahioka inside, his body shielding hers as they ducked low. The ranch house groaned under the assault, but John's hands were steady as he returned fire, each shot ringing with defiance. The fight raged until dawn, smoke choking the air, the ground littered with the blood of men who had thought hatred stronger than resolve. When the sun finally rose, the riders were gone, their torches extinguished, their threat broken. John staggered outside, his chest heaving, his hands raw. Beside him, Ahioka stepped into the morning light, her face streaked with soot but her eyes fierce. They stood together on the scarred earth, the land around them wounded but unbroken. And in that silence, heavy with smoke and the promise of more battles to come, John knew one truth above all: he had chosen her, and she had chosen him. Whatever storms came, whatever hatred tried to tear them apart, they would endure. Not because she could not live without a man, but because together they had found something greater than survival. They had found the strength to belong. The dawn spread across the battered ranch like a slow healing wound. Smoke still curled from the edges of the scorched earth where torches had burned, and the ground bore the scars of hoofprints, bullet casings, and blood that had dried into dark patches on the soil. John McAllister stood on the porch, his body heavy with exhaustion but his mind clear as the horizon. Beside him, Ahioka moved quietly, her hair tangled with ash, her dress torn but her posture unyielding. She had not wept, she had not crumbled, she stood as though her spirit had absorbed the flames and refused to be broken. For hours they worked without speaking, clearing debris, boarding up shattered windows, dragging bodies far out to the prairie where the coyotes and vultures would finish what hate had begun. It was grim work, but it was necessary. When they finished, John washed his hands at the well, watching the blood swirl into the dust. Ahioka joined him, her hands raw, her face smeared with soot, yet her eyes burned brighter than ever. "They will come again," she said at last, her voice steady but soft. "I know," John replied, his jaw tightening. "But so will we." Her gaze lingered on him, unreadable, as if she were weighing his soul against the future. Then, without another word, she placed her hand over his, their fingers locking together. It was not the touch of fear. It was the touch of a vow. The days that followed were strangely quiet. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the next storm. John doubled his efforts, repairing the house, reinforcing the fences, keeping his rifle close at hand. Ahioka worked with him, but her energy carried a different weight. She moved with the certainty of someone who had survived too much already, someone who understood that peace was always borrowed time. At night, as they lay on opposite sides of the fire, she would sometimes speak of dreams, of horses galloping through endless meadows, of rivers that sang, of a mother's lullaby that still echoed in her bones. John listened, though he rarely shared his own dreams. His were of simpler things, quiet mornings, laughter filling the house, the feel of another hand in his as the years wore down. Yet in her voice, he found pieces of his own unspoken longing. The bond between them deepened in ways neither could name. He found himself watching the curve of her mouth when she smiled at the horses, the way her laughter rang like a sudden storm breaking through drought. She, in turn, began to see the man beneath the hardened exterior, the gentleness in his calloused hands when he mended a broken saddle, the quiet sorrow in his eyes when the sun dipped low. But peace was fragile, and the world beyond their ranch was restless. Rumors reached John through travelers, whispers of settlers banding together, of raids blamed on tribes, of vengeance brewing like thunderclouds. The name, Apache, carried fear, and fear carried violence. One evening, as John sat sharpening his knife on the porch, Ahioka approached, her face set with resolve. "Teach me," she said. "Teach you what?" "To fight," she answered simply. John studied her. She had already proven her courage, diving into a raging creek, standing firm when men spat hatred at her. But the thought of placing a gun in her hands stirred a storm inside him. Still, he knew she was right. The world would not spare her, and his arms alone could not shield her forever. So he taught her. At dawn, he placed the rifle in her hands, guiding her grip, steadying her aim. Her eyes were sharp, her body quick to learn. Each shot echoed across the plains, and with each recoil she grew steadier, her resolve deepening. He taught her to ride faster, to track footprints in the dirt, to read the wind. She absorbed it all, not with eagerness but with necessity, as though each skill was another thread woven into her survival. But it was not just lessons of war. He showed her how to plant seeds in the hard earth, how to mend leather with care, how to whistle for the cattle when storms approached. She, in return, taught him the language of her people, soft words spoken beneath the stars, songs that carried sorrow and hope in equal measure. One night, as the fire cracked low, Ahioka placed her hand on his arm. "You are not alone anymore," she whispered. Her words cut through him, sharp as truth always does. For years he had carried loneliness like a cloak, believing it his burden until death. Yet here was a girl, once stranger, now tethered to him by more than need. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers, and in that silence something passed between them, an understanding, unspoken but undeniable. The ranch became more than land and cattle. It became a place of belonging, a fragile fortress against a hostile world. Together they worked, together they endured, and slowly, together they began to dream. But the shadows were never far. One morning, John rode into town for supplies. The streets fell silent when he arrived, men's eyes sharp with judgment, women whispering behind closed doors. At the general store, the keeper leaned close, his voice low. "They're planning something, McAllister. You'd do well to get rid of that girl before it's too late." John's eyes hardened. "She stays." The keeper shook his head, muttering as John gathered his goods. On the ride home, the weight of those words pressed heavy on him. He knew what men were capable of when fear turned to hate. That night, he told Ahioka what he had heard. She listened without flinching, her face calm. "I have lived with threats my whole life," she said. "But this is different. Here I am not running. Here I stand." Her defiance lit a fire in him. He pulled her close, his voice rough. "Then we stand together." The days turned sharper after that. Every sound on the horizon set John on edge. He doubled their defenses, taught her to fire from the porch, drilled her on where to run if the house came under siege. Yet through it all, they lived. They laughed, they worked, they shared the quiet comfort of two souls who had chosen each other against the world. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, John took her hand. "You said once you cannot live without a man," he said slowly. Her eyes lifted to his, steady and unafraid. "Yes." His voice softened, carrying the weight of all he had held back. "And I find I cannot live without you." Her breath caught, her eyes glistening. For a long moment, the world stilled, the prairie wind holding its breath. Then she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his, her voice barely a whisper. "Then we live together, no matter what comes." What came was fire again, but not the kind born of torches. It was the fire of change, of two lives intertwined, of a love forged not in ease but in trial. The land remained harsh, the threats remained real, but within the walls of that battered ranch house, there was something no hatred could extinguish. They rose each morning with the sun, side by side. They worked the earth, fed the cattle, mended what was broken. And each night, when the stars spread like diamonds across the endless sky, they sat together by the fire, their silence no longer hollow but full of promise, full of strength, full of the fragile yet unyielding bond that had saved them both. And though the world beyond their fences still whispered, still plotted, still threatened, John McAllister and Ahioka faced it together, bound not by desperation but by the powerful truth that love, once found, could root itself even in the harshest soil, and grow stronger than the storms that sought to tear it down. The plains had a way of remembering. Every scar carved into its soil, every drop of blood, every echo of hoofbeats, every fire that swept across the horizon, it lingered. John McAllister had lived long enough to know the land never forgot, but now, with Ahioka by his side, he began to believe the land could also forgive. They had rebuilt after the night of fire and bullets. The porch was stronger, the fences taller, the house patched and reinforced. Yet both of them knew peace was fragile, and the men who had come once would come again. Life in the weeks after was balanced between survival and something deeper. Each morning began with the sun rising over endless grass, painting the sky in colors so fierce it made the heart ache. John saddled his horse, Ahioka already awake with a bucket of water balanced on her shoulder, her movements graceful despite the weight. They worked without needing to speak much. Their silence was full of understanding, full of the bond that grew thicker each day. But it wasn't only work that filled their days. There were moments that stitched themselves into the fabric of their lives like bright threads in a rough cloth. She sang in Apache while she cooked, her voice soft and haunting, filling the air with sounds that once echoed through her village. He read aloud from his wife's old books, his deep voice stumbling over poetry he never thought he would care for until her eyes lit up at each verse. Together they created a rhythm, one that felt like it had always existed, only waiting for them to discover it. Yet every joy carried the shadow of danger. John rode into town less often, and when he did, he saw suspicion harden into hatred. Men muttered openly now, their hands twitching near holsters. Women pulled their children close. The sheriff himself warned him, his voice heavy with unease. "They won't forget, McAllister. Some folks already talk of teaching you a lesson you won't live through." John met the sheriff's gaze with steel. "Then they'll find me ready." When he told Ahioka that night, she listened without flinching. "You chose me once," she said. "Now you must choose again. To fight for me is to fight for us. To fight for us is to fight against the world." Her words carried weight, and John knew she was right. He had built his life on solitude, on keeping to himself, on letting the world pass by. But solitude had ended the moment she stumbled onto his land, desperate and fierce. He had chosen her then, and he would choose her again, no matter the cost. As weeks turned into months, whispers grew louder. Ranchers gathered in saloons, plotting, fueled by whiskey and fear. They told stories of Apache raids, of burned wagons, of stolen cattle. Few cared that Ahioka was only one girl, far from her people. To them, she was a symbol, and symbols were dangerous. One winter's night, as snow dusted the plains in white silence, the attack came. Torches flared in the distance, gunshots cracked the stillness, and voices shouted through the dark. John pulled Ahioka to cover, his rifle steady, his eyes sharp. Bullets whined through the walls, splintering wood, shattering glass. The air was thick with smoke and powder. Ahioka loaded rifles beside him, her hands sure, her face lit by firelight. She fought not with fear but with fury, her voice rising in a wordless cry that echoed her ancestors' battle songs. John felt a surge of pride as she fired into the night, her courage unbreakable. The fight lasted until dawn, when the attackers, bloodied and broken, finally retreated. Bodies lay scattered on the frozen ground, their torches extinguished. The ranch had once again survived, but at a cost. John's shoulder was torn by a bullet, blood soaking through his shirt. Ahioka bound it with steady hands, her eyes wet but her voice calm. "You will not leave me," she whispered fiercely. He gritted his teeth, his breath ragged. Never. Through pain and exhaustion, he saw her more clearly than ever. She was not simply a girl he had taken in, nor just a companion against loneliness. She was his partner, his equal, his anchor in a world that sought to break them. She had saved him as much as he had saved her. Winter passed into spring, and though the land healed, the scars remained. The attacks ceased, perhaps from fear, perhaps from defeat, but John knew hatred never truly died. Still, life returned. Grass grew green, calves were born, and laughter returned to the ranch. Ahioka planted flowers near the porch, their colors bright against the rough wood. John carved her name into a beam above the door, marking the house not as his, but as theirs. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air shimmered with gold, John took her hand. His voice was rough, but his words carried the weight of everything he had held inside. "You said once you couldn't live without a man. But it's me who can't live without you. You gave me back my life." Ahioka's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Then we belong to each other, not because we are weak, but because together we are strong." In that moment, with the land stretching endless around them, John knew they had already won. The world could rage, men could whisper, storms could come, but nothing could take from them what they had built. Their bond was forged in fire, sealed in blood, rooted in the soil beneath their feet. Years passed. The ranch grew, the fences stretched farther, and the house filled with the warmth of laughter. They lived not in fear, but in defiance of it, carving out a life where once there had only been loneliness and despair. Ahioka bore children, their faces carrying both her dark eyes and John's steady gaze. They grew strong, running barefoot through the fields, learning both the language of their mother's people and the lessons of their father's land. Travelers who passed by spoke of the ranch with awe, of the family that stood unbroken, of the love that endured against every storm. Some still whispered, still judged, but their voices grew faint against the undeniable truth that life had taken root where death had once threatened. In the quiet years, when John's hair turned silver and Ahioka's face carried the lines of time, they still sat side by side on the porch, watching the sun sink into the horizon. Their hands remained clasped, their silence full of all the words they no longer needed to speak. One evening, as the prairie wind sang its endless song, John turned to her. His voice was weak with age but strong with conviction. "We fought the world, Ahioka. And we won." She smiled, her eyes glistening with the same fire that had burned in her since the day she arrived at his ranch. "We did not win against the world. We won with each other." The land around them stretched eternal, bearing the memory of storms, of blood, of fire. Yet it also bore the memory of love, of defiance, of two souls who found each other against all odds. And in that vast, unforgiving wilderness, their story lived on, not of a girl who could not live without a man, nor of a man who thought he could survive alone, but of two hearts that had chosen to stand together, and in doing so, had found life where there should have been none. And when at last their time passed, when the porch stood empty and the prairie wind carried only silence, the ranch endured, a testament to love stronger than hate, to courage greater than fear, to a bond that no fire, no bullet, no whisper of prejudice could destroy. For the land remembers, and in its endless memory, the story of John McAllister and Ayoka was carved forever, a reminder that even in the harshest soil, love can take root and bloom eternal. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.